My name is Fred the Finch. You might know me as Ronald. I'm one of the best Yamatos in the game right now. And just yesterday, Deadlock released a patch that completely changed the entire shop system and almost every single item in the game. So today, I'm going to be going through how these changes affect Yamato. And in order to do this, I'm just going to be going through my own build. This isn't meant to be a promotion of my build in any way. It's just much simpler to do it in this fashion rather than going through every single item in the game and explaining it for Yamato. So we're just going to be going through my build, and I'll explain all my items as well as my thought process behind it. Before we talk about the build though, I think it's important to talk about the system changes they made and how those changed the game as well. The first and most obvious change that was made in this patch is that you now have 12 item slots instead of 16, and each of these item slots can be used for any item rather than being specialized to one kind of slot. This means that characters can be much more specialized in their builds and can really ignore one kind of item slot if they don't really want it, which is especially useful for Yamato, since oftentimes you really want to scale hard into her spirit power rather than focusing on her gun, and this allows you to do just that. Along with this change, Deadlock also made it so that there are a lot more items that upgrade into other items, as well as upgrading into multiple items and branching out into different things. However, even if an item does upgrade from a lower tier item, it still costs the same as everything in its tier. So something like Boundless Spirit, which upgrades from Improved Spirit and Extra Spirit, still only costs 6,400. So if you're upgrading from Improved Spirit, you're actually spending less souls. And just as a quick note, for things that do upgrade in a tree, you can own both of the different branches of the tree. So something like extra stamina upgrades into both kinetic dash and arcane surge, but you can own both of those at the same time. And the final major change to how the shop system itself works is how tier bonuses work. In the past, it worked very simply, where every tier 1 gun item would give a certain percentage of weapon damage, and then each tier 2 would give more, each tier 3 would give more, and each tier 4 would give more. But how it works now is that your tier bonuses are dependent on how many souls you spend in that category. So in order to get the first bonus, you need to spend 800 souls, and then 1600, 2400, and etc. So instead of each item giving you a different amount of bonus, it is dependent on how many souls you spend, and this can also be capped out. So for weapon damage, you're capped out at 88% damage. For vitality, you're capped out at 44% base health. And for spirit, you're capped out at 65 spirit. And this is after spending 28.8k souls in that category. And just to be clear, this doesn't mean that you're capped out at that amount of spirit power, that amount of health, and that amount of weapon damage. That just means that the amount of spirit power from the tier bonus itself is capped out at 65. So if you have an item like Boundless Spirit, which gives 40 extra spirit, it will still always give you that 40 spirit. It just might not contribute to giving you more through the base tier bonus like it would before. This change means that even though this shop allows you to be more specialized in your builds, it's not smart to only buy one type of item, and you should still diversify a little bit. And moving on from the shop system to different system changes inside of the game itself, that like drastically changed how barriers work. Before, barriers didn't interact with your resistances at all, but now barriers do interact with your resistances, and all of the barrier items were heavily reworked. And for the final system change, your boons now give you 2 spirit power. So this just means that your spirit is going to naturally scale itself up a little bit as time goes on, and even if you're not investing in spirit power itself, you are going to be gaining spirit power. And if you were curious, at max level, you have 38 extra spirit. Now, finally going into the build, we're going to start in the laning category, and then move into the mid, and then go over all of the late game items. Honestly, in terms of lane items, Yamato has not changed too much, so I'm not going to spend too much time going through all these items, but as I talk about each item, I will put up a little graphic to just show what they do, just because I think explaining what every single item does and all of the stats it has is not worth either of our time. So if you would like to look at them, if they're too fast, you can always pause the video to look. And then one more note, I'm going to be going through all of the items that I buy first, talk about why I buy them, and then after I get to the category, I'm going to bring up other items that I might have considered buying or tested and tell you why I didn't. So to start off laning, I get Restorative Shot, and as always, this item just keeps you alive and keeps you up for longer. gives you a lot of sustain. And then next, I get Mystic Burst, and this just adds 40 extra damage to your slash. And then Melee Lifesteal is still a great item for staying alive and more sustain and also more damage on your melees. Monster Rounds allows you to farm faster, kill minions faster, and you can tower dive better because guardians will do less damage to you. Extra stamina is still very strong, just add more mobility and extra maneuverability around the map. Rebuttal is one of the new items that is super helpful against punchy characters and just punchy players in general. So, especially if you're playing against something like Viscous or Abrams, you can buy this. But really, anybody in general, if they're going to punch you in lane, you can buy this and get a ton of value. Basically, when somebody punches you, if you parry their punch, then you get healed for how much damage they would have done, and they take that damage themselves. And then it also gives you a 50% extra melee damage bonus for 6 seconds. This item also reduces your parry cooldown by 2 seconds, so sometimes if you mess up the parry and people start punching you expecting your parry to be on cooldown, and then you parry again, you can catch them off guard and get a ton of value from that. Just be aware that gimmicks like that aren't going to work for too long once people get used to the new items and all of the different gimmicks. And then finally for lane, I get Restorative Locket. Now this item has been changed a reasonable amount from previously. You now get 20 heal per stack and you have 20 max stacks, but the heals per stack actually scales with spirit. So in the late game, this item can give you a ton of healing and is still super valuable to keep for a very long time. Oftentimes in late games, a max locket is healing for over 1200 health. And then also, when you use this now, you replenish 2 stamina points instead of 1. An item that you might notice is missing is Spirit Strike. And I dropped Spirit Strike simply because on this patch you have a lot of slot issues, so it's a lot harder to keep items like this, which are known for scaling better in the mid and late game and being a little bit weaker in the early game. Also, this item has been nerfed quite a few times and it gives significantly less Spirit Shred than it did previously. A new item that a lot of people are building is Mystic Regeneration, and this item is very good on a lot of characters, but Yamato's abilities just simply don't have a low enough cooldown to really validate this to heal more than something like Restorative Shot or even extra regen, so I don't think it's big value on Yamato, but it is super good on a lot of other characters. Mystic Expansion, previously known as Mystic Reach, is another thing that's missing from here, and that's simply because Mystic Expansion only gives ability range to one ability, where we previously used it to give it a little bit of extra range to every ability as well as increasing our restorative locket range. But it doesn't work like that now, so it's not worth it in my opinion. Moving into the midsection, we start with weapon or spirit shielding. I only recommend getting one of these. And these are the new kind of barrier items. And how they function is that they give you 400 overhealth if you take 150 spirit damage or 200 bullet damage in a 3.5-second time frame. This barrier does scale with spirit, so over time this will also get stronger and give you a little bit more overhealth. But as I said, I only recommend getting one of these, just like how we used to only get one armor. Next is Trophy Collector, and this is an item that scales with kill participation throughout the game. So as you get kills and assists, you get extra bonus health, sprint speed, ability range, and souls per minute. So this is a very big win more item. So if you're behind and your team is losing a lot, I probably wouldn't recommend this item, but it feels very strong and can really scale your character quite a bit. Next up is Healbane. This is just a staple in Yamato builds. It still does basically the same thing, with a little bit less healing reduction, as well as no longer giving bonus health. Spirit Sap is a new single target spirit item that gives minus 12% spirit resist, as well as taking some of their spirit power. This is a nice substitute for something like Mystic Vulnerability. Since we don't have Torment Pulse, that's much harder to proc before we hit our slash, so putting Spirit Sap on somebody before we slash them can get a ton of value and still amp your damage quite a bit. It also upgrades into a very, very strong. Spirit Shredder Bullets is one of our last gun items that we're going to get, and this is very similar to how Soul Shredder Bullets worked before, except now instead of giving you an amp and Spirit Lifesteal, it shreds the enemy's resist and gives your entire team 8% Spirit Lifesteal. This is significantly less healing, but I still believe that this item is pretty good, especially because it's a team-wide amp and it's Spirit Resist Shred. Next up is Mystic Reverb. This is another Yamato staple. Nothing really has changed. It gives a little bit less stats, but this item is still great. And then next is Tank Buster. This was previously known as Improved Burst, and this is just extra damage on each of your slashes, and it amps your reverb damage as well, like it previously did. And then we go into Compressed Cooldown and Superior Cooldown. The Imbue on Compressed Cooldown doesn't really matter since you immediately upgrade it into Superior Cooldown, but I do usually put it on ult if I am getting it. And then this will just lower all of your cooldowns, and this is especially useful if you're buying Counterspell or after you get refresh, but it is just a very useful item in general. And the next is another new item called Silence Wave. This is kind of the replacement of Silence Glyph. Instead of a small projectile, it is a large circular radius that you throw out in front of you, and it silences anybody in that radius, and it also reduces their spear resist by 12% and takes 18 of their spirit power. This is a very strong item that can silence a lot of characters and also take away their spear resist and take away their spirit power. And it's on a very short cooldown, especially since we get it after our cooldown reduction items. So I think if you're not getting this, you're doing yourself a disservice. Some of the most obvious items that you might notice are missing are Kinetic Dash and Mystic Shot, and this just comes down to slot issues as well. And most gun items that I don't buy just comes down to slot issues, honestly. And also, Kinetic Dash got changed, so instead of only using one stamina when you dash jump, it still uses two and just gives you the bonus instead. Mystic Shot also doesn't have a fall off range right now. I believe this is bugged, it might not be, but it is a very good poking item and can be very good value, so it might be better than something like Spirit Shredder bullets, but I'm not sure. Something a lot of people run in the gun category as tier 3s are Express Shot, and I think Express Shot is a strong item. However, I think it's too much of a detriment to not be able to shoot for 4 full seconds in order to get that amp damage. So, in my experience, it hasn't been worth it. And for Cultist Sacrifice, this item is also very, very strong. However, on Yamato, you don't care too much about the fire rate, and the ability range is nice, but it's not a big deal. So the bonus health is very good, but if you want something like that, you could also just get Fortitude. And I think Fortitude would be a stronger item for Yamato, Spirit Yamato in particular, but I don't think either of them really size up to the value that I want them to. Moving into Vitality, you might notice that we're missing armors or battle vests and enchanter's emblem, and I think that these items are very good. I'm not sure how they compare to Spirit Shielding, and in the future, we might end up running them over Spirit and Weapon Shielding. But right now, I believe the Spirit and Weapon Shielding are stronger because they give a lot of value early game with that big overhealth, and they also work with your resists. So if Spirit and Weapon Shielding get popped in your ult, then you get 400 bonus health with dual 60 or 45% resist, which is very strong. However, like I said, only time will tell on which one ends up being stronger, so it might flip flop a little bit. We're also missing Spirit Lifesteal, and this is the same story as before, where Locket just simply outperforms Spirit Lifesteal early, and especially because Locket scales into the late game, I believe that Locket is better late game as well. Healing Booster is another item that a lot of people like. It doesn't reduce the effectiveness of anti-heal anymore, so I'm not sure exactly how much stronger it is. It's still a great item, but just slot issues make it hard to fit in. And you might be wondering why, if we don't like Kinetic Dash, why don't we instead upgrade our extra stamina to Arcane Surge? And that's just because Arcane Surge is really awkward to use with Yamato. When you Arcane Surge for your 1, you have to dash jump, and then also when you use your 1, you want to dash 1. So that means you use 3 stamina just for 1 slash, and then if you want to upgrade your duration on your ult, you have to dash jump before your ult, and Yamato ult is a very reactive ult. So a lot of the time you don't have time to dash jump before you go. Another great item that we don't buy is Mystic Vulnerability, and Mystic Vulnerability gives less Spirit Resist Shred, and we also don't get Torment Pulse. So Torment Pulse is the easiest way to proc something like Mystic Vuln, and we don't have a consistent way to proc that before we hit our slash, so instead we just got Spirit Sap. And the final item that we mentioned a few times is Torment Pulse. And Torment Pulse is still a great item and it still does a lot of damage. However, the base damage was scaled back significantly. So now Torment Pulse only does 27 pulse damage base, and that does scale throughout the game. And because you get passive spirit throughout the game, it does gain more. But for Yamato, I really liked it as an early to mid game power spike, where now it does a lot less of that, simply because it has less base damage and is meant to scale later. And then finally, moving into the late game. As always with my builds, the late game doesn't have a specific build order, but generally earlier in the category is more useful more often. Starting off with Refresher, staple Yamato item. It doesn't give any extra stats anymore, but it's still amazing. Spirit Burn is one of the new items that was introduced, and it is very, very strong. As long as you deal 400 spirit damage within 5 seconds, you apply an 8-second debuff that reduces their healing by 80%, as well as doing some damage over time. This item is super, super strong and really late game. You should almost always have this. In my experience, a lot of late games tend to just come down to what team buys Spirit Burn and what doesn't, because the team without it is going to go against a ton of healing. They're not going to be able to kill anybody. Also, once you buy Spirit Burn, Healbane is super sellable since you don't really need that anti-heal anymore. Boundless Spirit is kind of different. It's less of just a pure stat stick. It still gives a lot of spirit power with 40 extra spirit power, but it also allows you to get 100 healing per ability cast every single time you cast the ability for 2 seconds, as well as 2 move speed. So when you're spamming abilities late game, this can be a ton of healing and a ton of extra damage. Kevlar is an item that I previously used a lot on Yamato that was a little bit controversial and kind of didn't work sometimes, but now it's really strong with her because barriers do interact with your resistances. So you get less spirit power than you did before, but now you get 1,000 over health, which does interact with your resist. So if you're getting shredded really hard in your ult, then you can just buy Kevlar. Debuff Reducer and Remover are both just amazing items as they always have been. One thing to note with Debuff Remover is that it doesn't work on ultimate abilities. So if you're trying to get rid of something like Pocket or Wraith Ult, it will not get rid of that. Counterspell is probably the coolest item, in my opinion, that's ever been added to this game, and it basically allows your parries to make you immune to any abilities or items. So this is perfect against a ton of things, but just a few examples that are super helpful are things like Lash Ult, Pocket Ult, Talon Ult, and Shiv Ult, but literally anything. It does have a reasonably long cooldown, but with superior cooldown, it gets a lot lower, and it allows you to dodge a lot of key cooldowns. This is a very high skill ceiling item, and it can be really hard to use, especially during the mental load of long team fights. But I think it's really worth getting it down. And right now, I'm going to be spamming it super often just to see how good it really can be. But I think only time will tell. Spirit Snatch is still a great item that does essentially the same thing it did before. If you're hitting a lot of melees during teamfights, then this can be a lot of value, especially if you're against a lot of spirit characters, which in this meta feels like a lot of characters are spirit characters. Crippling Headshot for Yamato is less value than it was before, as it reduces a reasonable amount less of their resists. It does also give minus healing reduction, but usually you have Healbane and or Spirit Burn, so Crippling Headshot is a little bit less value, and it also does have a 3-second cooldown now on it as well. Witchmail is another one of the new introduced items that is super interesting and will honestly just take a lot of experimentation to see how much value it is. But basically, when you take heavy hits of spirit damage, so 75 damage, it reduces a random cooldown by 3 seconds. So late game, when you're taking a ton of damage from a ton of different areas, this can reduce your cooldowns a ton and just make your uptime infinite and give you a ton of slashes, a ton of healing, and I believe it also reduces your ult cooldown. Phantom Strike is still great against gun characters and flyers to take them out of the air and turn off their guns. It doesn't give you the spirit resist it used to, but it's still a very good item. Spirit and bullet resilience are kind of the improved armors of the late game. These are very strong when you're getting shredded a lot, and late games when you're against like Vindicta and Mirage and just crippling headshots and a bunch of different resist shreds. They also give you additional resistance when you're below 30% health, which is very nice, and just make you tankier. As I mentioned earlier, Healing Booster doesn't give the resistance to anti-heals, so it's not quite as strong as it was before, but it's still a very good item. And now it upgrades into Healing Tempo. It gives more healing effectiveness. As soon as you use your 3, it'll give you extra fire rate and move speed, which is also very nice. And as I said before, the later in the category is a little bit less useful less often. So all of these items after now are going to be a lot more experimental and maybe less value, but are still interesting and worth a try. Scourge is another new item that was introduced that almost works as like a personal alch fire. So you put it on yourself and it does 3.5% of their max health per second in a small radius, as well as giving you 40% spear resist while it's on top of you. It does have a 10-second duration, which is quite big. And this is a very good item. However, I feel it is much better bought on a support character who puts it on you rather than you putting it on yourself. Obviously, you can't always ask somebody else to put it on you, but that's how I think it's the most powerful. Focus Lens is another new item that allows you to cast it on somebody, it silences them, and then as you do damage during the silence, once it expires, it'll do 30% of the damage you dealt again to them. This item seems to be very good on things like Haze, but I'm not sure how great it is on Yamato, and it is heavily countered by things like debuff remover and just debuff resist in general, since you'll have less time to accumulate that damage. Infuser was moved up to a tier 4 from a tier 1, and it functions similarly to a kind of spirit vampiric burst, where it gives 80% spirit lifesteal and extra spirit power when you cast it. There's very good base stats, and I think it is a very strong item. I'm not exactly sure how good it is on Yamato, still needs a lot of testing, but I could see a lot of potential in it for sure. Juggernaut is an item that just makes you super unkillable, as it just reduces their fire rate as soon as they look at you. Especially compounding this with your 3, they just won't be able to ever fight you. So this is also very strong against just straight gun characters. Spellbreaker is great against characters like Talon or just characters with a ton of spirit damage in the super late game, as it reduces one instance of heavy spirit damage by 75%, which is a lot and effectively means that you just didn't take that damage. And it has a relatively short cooldown, especially with superior cooldown. It's really not too long, so I think it can be a lot of value. And it also gives super strong base stats with extra debuff resist, which is always nice, and more spirit resist. And Spirit Rend is what they changed Spellslinger headshots into, and I'm not sure exactly how much value it is, but on Yamato specifically, it doesn't seem like it would be too much. It could be very good, as it can shred up to 35% of the spirit resist, but I'm just not sure how realistic of a situation that really is. Moving into the items that you might notice are missing, starting with Cheat Death is an item that works similarly but not the same to Soul Rebirth, and a lot of people seem to think that this is great on basically every character, but I think it's only really good on characters who are very tanky and have infinite uptime. And Yamato is almost the exact opposite of that. She is only really a character when she has her ult, and she's only tanky when she's in her ult. So oftentimes when you die, you don't have your ult anymore, so cheat death doesn't really bring you back to do much in the game. Leech is another item you might notice is missing, but it only gives 30% dual lifesteal right now. And I really think if you want more healing late game, things like healing booster are more value, especially because you have a reasonable amount of innate lifesteal just from the items that you're buying. Arctic Blast is the upgraded Cold Front, and while Arctic Blast seems like a very good item, the freeze is only 0.75 seconds, and unless you're in ult, your slash takes longer to charge than that. So you can't actually get the bonus damage from freezing them with your slash unless you're in your ult, which takes away a lot of the value to me. Overall, I think Yamato is really strong and really fun in this patch, and I'm excited to try out more items and different strategies. And I love to hear your opinions and your takes. So if you leave them in my comments, if you leave them in my Discord, if you comment stuff on my stream and talk about them, I would love to hear them. I would love to talk about them. Hope you learned something, and I'll see you next time.